The pyramid stands silent in the desert, keeping secrets that predate the pharaohs by thousands of years. What if everything we know about who built them is incomplete? What if the real story begins not with kings and dynasties, but with vanished people who walked these sands when they were still green? Tonight, we follow the evidence backward, beyond recorded history, into the realm of the forgotten builders. 50 kilometers southwest of Cairo, a lake sits in the desert. Lake Karun, the locals call it. Fishermen cast their nets here at dawn. Birds gather at its edges. But the lake knows things that the modern world has forgotten. In the 1920s, a British archaeologist named Gertrude Caton Thompson came to the shores of this lake. She was looking for pottery, for stone tools, for the usual traces of ancient life. What she found changed her understanding of human history in North Africa. Beneath the sand, she discovered the remains of grain storage pits. Not from pharaonic times, these were older, much older. Carbon dating would later place them around 5,400 BCE, more than 2,000 years before the first pyramid. But it wasn't just the age that surprised her, it was the sophistication. The storage pits were lined with woven reed baskets, waterproofed with a mixture of clay and animal fat. The grain inside had been carefully sorted, wheat separated from barley. Each type is stored in its own designated area. This wasn't the work of simple hunter-gatherers learning to farm. This was organized agriculture with planning and foresight. Around these storage pits, Caton Thompson found something else. Post holes, dozens of them, arranged in perfect rectangles. The wooden posts had long since rotted away, but their positions remained. When she mapped them out, she realized she was looking at the foundations of large communal buildings. Warehouses, perhaps, or meeting halls. The people who built these structures understood load-bearing architecture. They knew how to create foundations that would remain stable in shifting sand. They had developed systems for storing surplus food, which meant they could support specialists. People who didn't farm. People who could focus on other skills, like a working stone. Near the largest building foundation, Caton Thompson's team found a workshop area. Scattered across the ground were hundreds of stone flakes, the debris from tool making. But mixed in with these ordinary flakes was something extraordinary. Partially completed stone vessels. These weren't crude bowls hammered out of soft limestone. These were made from diorite, one of the hardest stones available in Egypt. The vessels showed evidence of drilling, grinding, and polishing. 3 separate techniques that required 3 separate sets of specialized tools. The interior curves were perfectly smooth. The walls were of uniform thickness. Some vessels were less than half a centimeter thick. At that thickness, a single mistake, a moment of excess pressure, would shatter the entire piece. Whoever made these had mastered their craft through years of practice. Caton Thompson published her findings in 1934. She proposed that the Fayum, as this region around Lake Karun is called, had been home to a sophisticated culture thousands of years before the pharaohs. A culture with surplus food, specialized craftsmen, and advanced stoneworking techniques. The academic world had largely ignored her. Egypt's history, they said, began with King Nama around 3100 BCE. everything before that was primitive, unorganized, irrelevant. The idea that complex civilization existed in the Fayum 2,000 years earlier didn't fit the accepted narrative, so it was set aside. But the evidence didn't disappear. It sat in museum storage rooms, carefully labelled and catalogued, waiting for someone to look at it again with fresh eyes. In 1976, a team of Polish archaeologists returned to the Fayum. They used new dating methods, ground-penetrating radar, aerial photography. What they found vindicated Caton Thompson's work and expanded it dramatically. The settlement around Lake Karun wasn't isolated. It was part of a network. Similar sites dotted the region, all from the same period, all showing the same level of organization, all connected by pathways that were still visible as faint lines in satellite imagery. At a site called Com K, they found evidence of copper smelting dating to 5,200 BCE. Not just using copper, but creating it, transforming ore into metal through controlled heating. This required knowledge of temperature management, of chemical processes, of metallurgy. The furnaces they built could reach temperatures of over 1,000 degrees Celsius. They used ceramic blue pipes to increase airflow. The slag heaps left behind showed they had produced copper tools in significant quantities. Why does this matter? Because copper tools could cut stone more effectively than stone tools. They opened up new possibilities in construction. And the dates line up perfectly. The appearance of sophisticated copper working in the Fayum around 5,200 BCE comes just before we start seeing evidence of large-scale stonework in the region. At Com W, another Fayum site, archaeologists found carved stone blocks that appeared to be foundation markers. Each one showed a shallow depression on top, as if something had rested there. Posts, perhaps, or pillars. The blocks were arranged in alignments that ran east to west. When archaeologists checked these alignments against the sunrise, they found something remarkable. The blocks aligned perfectly with the equinox sunrise, the moment when day and night are equal length. This wasn't an accident. This was astronomical knowledge being used in architectural planning. The same knowledge that would later be used at Giza. The people of the Fayum were watching the sky. They were tracking the sun's movement through the year. They were incorporating this celestial knowledge into their buildings. And they were doing it more than 2,000 years before the first pyramid. But who were they? The skeletal remains found at the Fayum sites show interesting patterns. These people were taller, on average, than later Egyptians. Their bone structure suggests a diet rich in fish and waterfowl. The lake that is now shrinking and salty was once fresh and teeming with life. Genetic analysis conducted in 2003 revealed something unexpected. The Fayum people showed genetic markers common in populations from both the Nile Valley and the Eastern Sahara. They were a mixture, a meeting point of different groups, which makes sense when you look at geography. The Fayum sits at a crossroads. To the east lies the Nile Valley, to the west, the desert that was once savanna, to the north, the delta, to the south, Upper Egypt. Groups moving through this landscape would naturally stop at the lake. Fresh water, fish, fertile soil. Some would stay. They would meet others who had come from different directions. Ideas would mix, techniques would blend, innovation would accelerate. And perhaps, in this mixing, something new was born. A culture that combined the stoneworking traditions of the desert peoples with the agricultural knowledge of the Nile Valley. A culture that would develop techniques later used in building the pyramids. The Fayum sites show clear evidence of contact with regions far to the west. Pottery styles that originated in what is now Libya appear here. So do specific types of stone beads that come from the Central Sahara, hundreds of kilometers away. These people were trading across vast distances. They were part of a wider network that we're only beginning to understand. In 1999, excavations at a site called Giza El Saga on the northern shore of Lake Karun uncovered something that changed the timeline again. A stone building, not a house, not a storage facility, a temple. The structure predated the Old Kingdom by at least 1,500 years. It was built from limestone blocks, each weighing several tons. The blocks had been shaped to fit together precisely. No mortar, just stone on stone, so tightly joined that a knife blade couldn't fit between them. The technique is identical to what we see later at Giza. Inside the temple, archaeologists found no inscriptions, no statues, no clues about what god was worshipped here or what rituals were performed. But the building's orientation told a story. It faced due east, the entrance aligned with the equinox sunrise, just like the foundation stones at Com W. The astronomical knowledge had become architectural practice. The people of the Fayum weren't just watching the sky. They were building monuments aligned to it. They were creating sacred spaces oriented to cosmic cycles. They were doing what would later become a defining characteristic of Egyptian civilization. But they were doing it in an age before Egypt existed. Lake Karun still sits in the desert, shrinking slowly under the relentless sun. The sites around its shores are mostly empty now. The stone tools and pottery fragments sit in museums. The foundation markers and temple ruins are visited mainly by researchers and the occasional tourist who has strayed far from the usual paths. But the lake remembers. In its sediment layers lie pollen grains from plants that once grew thick around its shores. In its depths rest fishing weights, carved from stone, dropped there 5,000 years ago by hands that knew how to shape the hardest rock into tools that would help build pyramids. The Fayum was not the beginning, but it was a crucial chapter, a place where knowledge gathered, where techniques developed, where the foundations were laid for what would come later. And it all happened in the shadow of a lake that the modern world barely notices. The western desert of Egypt is a landscape of extreme emptiness. Mile after mile of sand and rock stretching toward Libya. No trees, no rivers, no obvious reason for humans to linger here. Yet they did. In 1873, a German explorer named Gerhard Rolfs was crossing this desert when his guide pointed out something unusual. A circle of stones on the ground. Rolfs dismounted and examined it. The stones were arranged too precisely to be natural. Someone had placed them deliberately. His guide told him there were more, many more. Over the next 3 days, Rolfs documented 47 stone circles in that region, all roughly the same size, about 5 meters in diameter, all oriented with an opening facing northeast. The stones themselves were unremarkable, local desert rock, but their arrangement was anything but random. Rolfs published a brief account of his findings. It was noted in academic journals and then forgotten. The Western Desert was considered barren, lifeless, unimportant. Why would anyone build stone circles there? The question went unanswered for more than a century. In 1998, a team of researchers using satellite imagery to study ancient climate patterns noticed something odd in the Western Desert. Faint lines visible from space crisscrossing the sand in geometric patterns. When they investigated on the ground, they found the lines were actually shallow trenches, mostly filled in by wind-blown sand. The trenches ran for kilometers, perfectly straight, connecting stone circles identical to the ones Rolfs had documented. Ground-penetrating radar revealed that beneath the sand, the trenches were deeper than they appeared. In some places, they'd been cut down through layers of sandstone to reach harder bedrock below. This was deliberate excavation on a massive scale. But when and why? Organic material found in one trench provided an answer to the first question. Carbon dating placed it at 6,800 BCE, nearly 9,000 years ago, a time when this desert wasn't desert at all, but grassland dotted with seasonal lakes. The why is harder to answer, but the geometry provides clues. The trenches don't wander. They maintain absolute straightness across difficult terrain, up hills and down into valleys. This level of precision requires surveying. Someone had to sight along these lines, mark them, and ensure they stayed true over distances of multiple kilometers. It requires planning, knowledge of geometry, an understanding of how to maintain a bearing across a landscape that offers few natural landmarks. The stone circles connected by these trenches show another interesting feature. When researchers mapped their positions and checked them against astronomical data, they found that certain circles aligned with each other and with the rising points of specific stars. Not the stars as they appear now, the stars as they appeared in 6,800 BCE. The Earth's axis wobbles slowly over time, a phenomenon called precession. This wobble changes which stars rise at which points on the horizon. The alignment only makes sense for that specific period in history. Whoever built these circles was watching the sky with precision and encoding that knowledge in stone. But the most intriguing discovery came when researchers analyzed the spacing between the circles. The distances weren't random. They followed a pattern, a unit of measurement repeated over and over. This unit turned out to be approximately 2.8 meters, which is almost exactly the length of a cubit and a half. The royal cubit, the standard unit of measurement in pharaonic Egypt, was 52.3 centimeters. 3 royal cubits would be about 1.57 meters. Double that and you get 3.14 meters. Close enough to the spacing unit that it can't be coincidence. Whoever laid out these circles was using a standardized measurement system, the same system, or something very close to it, that would later be used to design the pyramids. This challenged a fundamental assumption. The cubit was thought to have been invented during the early dynastic period, around 3000 BCE. Here was evidence of its use nearly 4,000 years earlier. Among the stone circles, researchers found tools, grinding stones for processing grain, scrapers for working leather, and something unexpected, pieces of obsidian. Obsidian is volcanic glass. It doesn't occur naturally anywhere in Egypt. The nearest source is in Ethiopia, over 2,000 kilometers away. Yet here it was, scattered around ancient campsites in the western desert. This meant trade networks, long-distance exchange of valuable materials, organizations sophisticated enough to move goods across vast distances in an age before written records, before pack animals, before any of the infrastructure we associate with commerce. The people using these sites weren't isolated nomads struggling to survive. They were part of something larger. In 2004, archaeologists excavating near one of the larger stone circles found a burial. The body had been placed in a flexed position, knees drawn up to chest. Beside it lay grave goods, a finely worked stone knife, shell beads that had come from the Red Sea, and a small carved figurine. The figurine was made from limestone. It showed a human form, stylized but recognizable. The proportions were carefully rendered. The surface had been polished smooth. It was art, created not for utility, but for meaning, for beauty, for some purpose we can only guess at. The burial dates to 6500 BCE. Whoever this person was, their community valued them enough to inter them with precious objects gathered from across hundreds of kilometers. They had developed concepts of an afterlife important enough to warrant burial with goods. They had aesthetic sensibilities sophisticated enough to create art. These are not characteristics of a primitive society. The stone circles and trenches represent something remarkable. A civilization capable of large-scale projects requiring coordination, planning, and specialized knowledge. They had developed standardized measurements. They understood geometry. They watched the stars and incorporated astronomical knowledge into their constructions. All the elements that would later appear in pyramid building were present here, in primitive form, thousands of years earlier. But then something changed. Around 5500 BCE, the climate shifted. The African humid period, which had brought regular rains to the Sahara for thousands of years, began to end. The grasslands started to dry. The seasonal lakes became less reliable. The stone circles show evidence of this change. At the older sites, from 6800 to 6000 BCE, the circles are large and well maintained. The trenches are deep and clear. But the later sites, from 6000 to 5500 BCE, are smaller. The trenches are shallower. The construction is less careful. And then, around 5500 BCE, they stopped entirely. The people moved on. They had to. The land could no longer support them. But where did they go? Answer appears to be eastward, toward the only permanent water source in the region, the Nile. In the Nile Valley, around 5200 BCE, we see a sudden increase in settlement size and sophistication. Sites that were small villages become substantial towns. New techniques appear in pottery making. Stone tool styles that originated in the Western Desert start showing up in Nile Valley sites. Most tellingly, we start seeing the same standardized measurement system. The same proto-cubit that organized the Western Desert circles now appears in the layout of Nile Valley settlements. The knowledge didn't disappear when the desert dried. It migrated. The people who had spent thousands of years perfecting their understanding of geometry, astronomy, and construction in the Western Desert brought those skills to the Nile. They joined with the agricultural communities already there. Their knowledge mixed with local traditions. And from that mixing, something new emerged. The stone circles still stand in the Western Desert, though most are half buried by sand. The trenches are visible only from the air or with special equipment. Few people know they exist, but they represent a crucial piece of the puzzle. They show that the techniques used to build the pyramids didn't appear suddenly. They were developed over thousands of years by people whose names we'll never know. People who watched the stars from stone circles in a green Sahara that no longer exists. Between the Nile Valley and the Red Sea lies a landscape the ancient Egyptians called Deshret, the Red Land, a territory of sun-scorched mountains, dry wadis, and rock formations twisted by eons of heat. It seems like an unlikely place to find the origins of sophisticated architecture. Yet that's exactly where some of the most intriguing evidence appears. In 1936, the Geological Survey team working in Wadi Hammamat stumbled across something unexpected. They were mapping mineral deposits, documenting the ancient quarries that had supplied stone to pharaonic building projects. But in a side canyon, far from the main quarry sites, they found something that didn't fit. A platform carved directly into the mountainside. The platform was roughly 12 meters square, cut into solid granite with vertical walls on 3 sides. The floor was level to within a few centimeters across its entire surface. This kind of precision is difficult to achieve even with modern tools. In 1936, they had no way to date the platform. It showed no inscriptions, no pottery fragments, nothing that could be tied to a specific period. The survey team documented it, noted its unusual precision, and moved on. 70 years later, researchers returned with modern equipment. Luminescence dating of quartz grains in the disturbed rock around the platform provided an age estimate: 7,200 BCE, give or take 300 years. This placed it firmly in the Neolithic period, thousands of years before the Old Kingdom. But the platform wasn't alone. Using aerial photography and ground surveys, researchers found 17 more platforms in the surrounding wadis, all carved with similar precision, all from approximately the same period. What were they for? The platforms face east toward the rising sun. They're positioned to catch the first light of dawn. This suggests some kind of ritual or observational purpose. But the level of effort involved seems disproportionate to simple sun watching. Each platform required weeks of work with stone tools. The granite here is some of the hardest rock in Egypt. Carving through it demands patience, skill, and purpose. On 3 of the platforms, researchers found shallow grooves cut into the floor. The grooves formed grids, like the squares on a chessboard. Each square was roughly the same size, about 52 centimeters on a side. A royal cubit. The same unit of measurement appeared again, this time carved into granite platforms from 7,200 BCE. Near one platform, a rock overhang provided shelter from the sun. Beneath it, archaeologists found a workshop area. The debris field contained thousands of stone flakes, the waste from tool making. But more importantly, it contained practice pieces. These were blocks of softer limestone that showed evidence of deliberate cutting exercises. Straight lines carved over and over. Corners practiced until they were perfect right angles. Curved surfaces ground and polished smooth. Someone was teaching stone carving here, training apprentices in techniques that would later be used on a monumental scale. The practice blocks showed a progression from crude to refined. Early attempts were rough, uneven. Later attempts showed increasing confidence and control. This was a learning process, documented in stone. Among the debris, researchers found something remarkable: copper chisels. The chisels were heavily worn, their edges blunted by hard use. Metallurgical analysis showed they were made from relatively pure copper, with small amounts of arsenic added to harden the metal. This is a sophisticated alloy, not just naturally occurring copper hammered into shape. Carbon dating of organic material in the same layer as the chisels placed them at 7,000 BCE. This is important because it pushes back the timeline for metalworking in Egypt by more than 1,000 years. It also explains how the platforms could have been carved with such precision. Metal tools, even relatively soft copper ones, are far more effective than stone for working granite. The presence of these chisels suggests organized mining and smelting operations. Copper doesn't occur in the Red Sea Mountains. It had to be brought in from elsewhere, Sinai most likely, where copper deposits were known and exploited in later periods. This means trade routes, supply chains, organizations sophisticated enough to move raw materials from Sinai to the Red Sea Mountains, smelt them into tools, and use those tools in stone carving operations. All of this happened in 7,000 BCE. The workshop area also revealed evidence of another technology: abrasive cutting. Scattered throughout the debris were small pieces of quartz sand, not unusual in a desert environment. But this sand showed something interesting under microscopic examination. The grains had been crushed, deliberately broken down into finer particles. When mixed with water, crushed quartz forms an effective abrasive paste. Applied to copper tools, it dramatically increases their cutting power. The copper acts as a carrier for the abrasive, which does the actual cutting. This technique would later become standard in pharaonic stoneworking. Here, it was being used 7,000 years earlier. The platforms themselves show tool marks that are consistent with abrasive cutting. Long, straight grooves where copper saws loaded with quartz sand cut through granite. The grooves are parallel and evenly spaced, showing controlled, systematic work. In 2011, researchers made another discovery in the Red Sea Mountains. About 15 kilometers from the platform sites, they found a settlement. Not temporary camps, permanent structures. The buildings were made from dry stacked stone, walls built without mortar, but fitted together with considerable care. The structures formed a rough rectangle, about 30 meters on each side, enclosing a central courtyard. Inside the courtyard were the remains of smelting furnaces. The furnaces had been built from fire-resistant sandstone, shaped into crucibles that could withstand the high temperatures needed for copper smelting. Radiocarbon dating of charcoal from the furnaces gave dates ranging from 7,100 to 6,800 BCE. This settlement appears to have been a specialized site dedicated to metalworking and stone carving. The people living here weren't farming, they weren't herding, they were craftsmen, focused on developing and refining techniques for working with metal and stone. The settlement shows evidence of contact with the Nile Valley. Pottery found here matches styles from sites like Merimde in the Delta and Badari in Upper Egypt. But the stone tools show influences from farther west, from the desert regions where the stone circles stood. This was a mixing place, a point where different traditions met and combined. The metallurgical analysis of the copper chisels revealed something else interesting. The copper contained trace elements that match ore sources in Timna, in what is now southern Israel. This pushes the trade networks even farther. These people were either traveling to Timna themselves, a journey of several hundred kilometers through difficult terrain, or they were part of a trade network sophisticated enough to move specialized materials across those distances. Either way, it demonstrates a level of organization and planning that doesn't fit our image of Neolithic society. The settlement was occupied for about 300 years, from roughly 7,100 to 6,800 BCE. Then it was abandoned. The furnaces went cold. The stone carving platforms were left empty. Why? The answer may lie in climate data. Core samples taken from Red Sea sediments show a brief but intense dry period around 6,800 BCE. Rainfall dropped dramatically. The ephemeral streams that had made settlement possible in the wadis dried up. Without water, the settlement couldn't be maintained. The inhabitants moved on, likely toward the Nile, where water was guaranteed. But they took their knowledge with them. The techniques developed in these Red Sea mountain sites, the abrasive cutting, the copper tool making, the understanding of how to carve and shape the hardest stone, all of these appear later in the Nile Valley. In sites from 6,500 BCE onward, we start seeing stone vessels made with drilling techniques. We see copper tools becoming more common. We see stone architecture becoming more sophisticated. The knowledge flows eastward toward the Nile, carried by people fleeing a changing climate. The platforms still stand in the Red Sea mountains, slowly eroding under the relentless sun. The settlement ruins are barely visible, just low walls of tumbled stone that most travelers would pass without a second glance. But these sites represent something crucial. They show that specialized stone working knowledge existed in Egypt thousands of years before the pyramids. They show that this knowledge was developed in workshops where masters trained apprentices, where techniques were tested and refined over generations. The architects of the pyramids didn't invent these techniques. They inherited them from people who had carved platforms in the Red Mountains, who had mixed copper and quartz to cut through granite, who had developed standardized measurements and passed them down through the centuries. The Red Land kept these secrets for a long time. Now, slowly, we're learning to read them. 100 kilometers west of Abu Simbel, in a shallow basin that fills with water perhaps once every 10 years, stands a circle of stones. Most of the year, Nabta Playa is empty, dry, lifeless. The stones sit half buried in sand, easy to miss if you don't know what you're looking for. But these stones are not random. They were placed with purpose, with knowledge, with an understanding of the sky that challenges everything we thought we knew about the ancient world. The stone circle at Nabta was first documented in 1974 by a team led by archaeologist Fred Wendorf. They were mapping ancient settlement sites in the Nubian desert, tracking the movement of early pastoral groups. What they found at Nabta didn't fit the pattern. The circle consisted of 29 upright stones, arranged in an oval roughly 4 meters across. Doesn't sound particularly impressive, but when Wendorf's team began excavating around the stones, they found something unexpected. The stones had been deliberately buried up to their midpoints. This meant someone had dug holes, positioned the stones, then backfilled around them. Each stone was anchored, meant to stand for a long time. Radiocarbon dating of the site gave dates clustering around 5,500 BCE. But that was just the beginning. As excavations continued over the next decades, the site revealed layer upon layer of use. The deepest layers, from around 7,000 BCE, showed evidence of seasonal camps. People came to Nabta when the basin filled with rainwater, drawn by the temporary lakes that formed there. But around 6,000 BCE, something changed. The camps became more permanent. Structures appeared, and the stones were erected. In 1992, Wendorf's team found something else. Buried beneath some of the stones were cattle bones. Not just scattered remains, but deliberate burials. Entire cow skulls, still articulated, placed in carved bedrock chambers and covered with stone slabs. This was ritual behavior. Cattle were sacred to these people, important enough to warrant careful burial. Around the central stone circle, researchers found megalithic alignments stretching outward, lines of stones pointing towards specific positions on the horizon. When astronomer Kim Malville analyzed these alignments, he discovered something remarkable. The stones aligned with the summer solstice sunrise as it appeared in 6,000 BCE. But there was more. Malville noticed that one set of stones aligned with a particularly bright star. Not just any star, but Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky. The alignment pointed to the exact position where Sirius would have first appeared above the horizon in the pre-dawn sky around 6,000 BCE. This is called heliacal rising. It's the moment when a star first becomes visible in the dawn, emerging from the sun's glare. For agricultural societies, these moments were crucial timing markers. In later Egyptian civilization, the heliacal rising of Sirius marked the beginning of the annual Nile flood, the most important event in the agricultural calendar. Temples were oriented to this event. Festivals were timed to it. And here at Nabta, 3,000 years before the first pyramid, people were already tracking it. The precision is remarkable. The alignment isn't approximate, it's exact to within a degree of arc. This level of accuracy requires years of observation. You have to watch the sky, night after night, season after season, until you understand the patterns well enough to encode them in stone. But Nabta's astronomical sophistication goes even deeper. In 2007, astrophysicist Thomas Brophy published an analysis of the stone alignments that sent shockwaves through the archaeological community. Brophy claimed that the stones didn't just mark the positions of stars as they appeared around 6000 BCE. They also showed an understanding of precessional movement. Precession is the slow wobble of Earth's axis. It takes roughly 26,000 years to complete one full cycle. This wobble changes the position of stars relative to the horizon. The changes are tiny, impossible to notice in a single lifetime, but over thousands of years they add up. Brophy's analysis suggested that the placement of certain stones at Nabta reflected star positions not from 6000 BCE, but from much earlier, from 16,500 BCE. This claim was controversial. How could a Neolithic society understand precession? That requires continuous observation spanning thousands of years. It requires passing knowledge down across hundreds of generations with enough precision that the measurements remain accurate. Many archaeologists rejected Brophy's interpretation. Too complex, they said, too sophisticated. There must be a simpler explanation. But Brophy's analysis raised uncomfortable questions. The stone positions at Nabta do match earlier star configurations better than they match the sky of 6000 BCE. That's a fact. Whether it's intentional or coincidental remains debated. What's not debated is the sophistication of the site itself. Nabta Playa represents the earliest known stone circle anywhere in the world. It predates Stonehenge by at least 1500 years. It shows a level of astronomical knowledge that wouldn't appear in Europe for thousands of years. And it's not alone. Scattered across the Nubian desert, researchers have found dozens of smaller stone structures. Most are aligned to astronomical phenomena. Some mark solstices, others mark the rising points of stars. Together, they suggest a culture deeply engaged with the sky, a culture that tracked celestial cycles and encoded them in stone monuments. Why? The most likely explanation ties to survival. These were pastoral people, moving with their herds across a landscape that was slowly drying out. Water was becoming scarce, rain was unpredictable, but the stars were reliable. If you could track the stars, you could predict the seasons. You could know when and where the rains might come. You could plan your movements accordingly. This knowledge was valuable, worth encoding in permanent form, worth preserving across generations. But there may be more to it than pure practicality. The cattle burials at Nabta suggest ritual behavior. The careful placement of the stones, the precision of the alignments, the effort involved in construction. All of this suggests that Nabta was more than a calendar. It was a sacred space. The stars weren't just tools for navigation and timing. They were connected to belief, to cosmology, to understanding the universe. This matters because it's the same pattern we see later in Egypt. The pyramids aren't just tombs. They're encoded with astronomical knowledge. They're aligned to stars and solstices. They represent a worldview in which Earth and sky are intimately connected. That worldview didn't originate with the pharaohs. It has much older roots that stretch back to Nabta and beyond. Around 5000 BCE, Nabta Playa was abandoned. The rains failed completely. The basin stopped filling. The people who had gathered there for thousands of years moved on. Most likely, they moved east, toward the Nile. In the Nile Valley, around 4800 BCE, we see a sudden increase in complex architecture. We see astronomical alignments appearing in building layouts. We see cattle gaining increased importance in ritual contexts. All patterns that originated at Nabta. The knowledge didn't disappear when the desert dried. It migrated. The Star Watchers brought their understanding of the sky to the Nile. They taught others. The knowledge spread and evolved. By the time the pyramids were built, astronomical orientation was a fundamental part of Egyptian architecture. The tradition had become so established that every temple, every tomb, every significant structure was carefully aligned to celestial phenomena. But that tradition began at Nabta, with stones arranged by people whose names we'll never know. The circle still stands in the desert, visited now mainly by researchers and the occasional adventurous tourist. The stones are worn by wind and sand. Some have toppled, but the alignments remain, pointing towards star positions that only make sense when you know they were meant for a sky thousands of years in the past. They represent humanity's oldest observatory, the first place where people systematically studied the heavens and preserved their findings in permanent form. And they remind us that the sophistication we see in Egypt's pyramids didn't appear from nowhere. It was built on knowledge accumulated over thousands of years by cultures we're only beginning to understand. The Nile Delta is a maze of channels, marshes, and agricultural fields. For thousands of years, the Nile has been depositing silt here, building up layer upon layer of sediment. The ancient landscape lies buried, sometimes 5 to 10 meters below the current surface. For archaeologists, this presents both a problem and an opportunity. The problem: excavating through meters of alluvial deposit is expensive and time-consuming. The opportunity: perfect preservation. Sites buried quickly by flood silts remain largely undisturbed. In 2015, a team using ground-penetrating radar began surveying areas near the town of Kafr Hassan Dawid, about 100 kilometers north of Cairo. They were looking for traces of ancient settlements, expecting to find perhaps some pottery scatter, maybe a few mud brick foundations. What they found was a city. The radar images showed an extensive network of structures buried 8 meters below the current surface. Streets laid out in a grid pattern, large rectangular buildings, what appeared to be a central plaza or marketplace, and most remarkably, a canal system. The canals were engineered, straight channels with consistent widths, connecting different parts of the settlement. These weren't natural waterways. They had been dug, shaped, and maintained. When the team finally excavated a test trench in 2017, they found the radar hadn't lied. The structures were there, preserved in anaerobic mud that had protected organic materials. Wooden beams still held their shape. Reed matting remained intact. Even rope, twisted from papyrus fibers, could still be unwound. The preservation was so good that they found food remains, grain in storage jars, fish bones, the shells of freshwater clams, and crucially, plant material that could be carbon dated. The dates came back clustering around 5,800 BCE. This made the settlement older than the first pharaonic dynasties by nearly 1,000 years. Older than the Step Pyramid. Older than Memphis itself. Yet here was urban planning, canal engineering, and large-scale architecture. The buildings showed sophisticated construction techniques. The foundations were laid on wooden pilings driven deep into the marsh mud. This prevented settling and kept the structures stable despite the waterlogged ground. The same technique would later be used for major temples and palaces throughout the delta. Someone had figured out how to build permanent structures in one of the most challenging environments imaginable. The walls were made from woven reed panels, plastered with mud mixed with chopped straw. Simple materials, but used with great skill. The panels were woven in a pattern that provided structural strength, while remaining flexible enough to handle ground movement. The mud plaster was applied in multiple thin layers, rather than one thick coat, which prevented cracking as it dried. These aren't techniques you stumble upon by accident. They represent generations of experimentation and refinement. One building stood out, larger than the others, positioned at the center of the settlement. When excavated, it revealed something unexpected. A stone floor. Not flagstones, not paving. A single piece of limestone, roughly 4 meters square, carved to fit precisely into the space. The floor was perfectly level and polished smooth. Limestone doesn't occur naturally in the delta. It had to be brought from quarries in the Nile Valley or the desert margins. Moving a 4-meter stone slab through marsh channels would have required boats specifically designed for heavy cargo. It would have required knowledge of how to load, balance, and unload multi-ton stones without capsizing. The presence of this floor raises questions. Why go to such effort? What function did this building serve that warranted a stone floor when every other structure may do with packed earth or reed matting? The answer may lie in what was found on the floor's surface. Traces of ash and charred bone. The floor had been used for fire, for burning offerings. This was likely a temple or shrine, a sacred space important enough to merit permanent stone construction. Around this central building, the excavators found evidence of specialized workshops. One area showed concentrations of copper slag and fragments of crucibles, metalworking. Another area held thousands of tiny stone drill bits, the kind used for working stone beads. A third contained loom weights and bone needles, indicating textile production. This wasn't a self-sufficient farming village. It was a center of specialized production. People here were making things for trade, not just for local use. The canal system reinforced this interpretation. The canals connected the settlement to the main branches of the Nile. Boats could come and go, bringing raw materials in and carrying finished goods out. The settlement was positioned at a crossroads of water routes, able to trade both north toward the Mediterranean and south toward the Nile Valley. In one building, excavators found something remarkable, a collection of weights. The weights were made from polished stone, shaped into cylinders. Each one was inscribed with a simple mark, a series of notches carved around the circumference. The marks appeared to indicate value, with more notches meaning heavier weights. When the weights were measured, they showed a consistent system. The smallest weighed about 9 grams. The next size up was was roughly 27 grams, exactly 3 times the smallest. The pattern continued: 81 grams, 243 grams, 729 grams. This is a base 3 system. Each weight is 3 times the previous one. Such a system allows for precise measurement through combination. You can measure any quantity by combining the right selection of weights. The significance is profound. This shows mathematical understanding. An abstract concept, multiplication, being applied to create a practical tool for commerce. It shows that these people weren't just trading. They were quantifying trade, measuring it, standardizing it. The base 3 system is also interesting because it's unusual. Most ancient cultures used base 10 or base 12 systems. Base 3 is rare, but it has advantages for weight measurement because you only need a small set of weights to measure a wide range of masses. Someone who'd thought this through, had done the mathematics, had created a system and implemented it. Among the artifacts recovered from the settlement were pottery vessels that provided more surprises. The pottery was well made, fired at consistent temperatures, decorated with geometric patterns. But what mattered was what some vessels contained. Residue analysis showed traces of wine. Wine requires grapes. Grapes don't grow in the delta marshlands. They grow in the drier regions to the east and south. The presence of wine means trade connections extending beyond the immediate region. But more than that, wine production requires specialized knowledge. You need to know when to harvest, how to crush grapes, how to ferment the juice, and how to store it without spoiling. The Delta people either had this knowledge themselves or were trading with people who did. Other vessels contained residues of oils extracted from plants that don't grow in Egypt at all. These came from the Levant, from what is now Lebanon and Syria. Somehow, goods were moving from the Mediterranean coast to the delta marshes. This suggests trade networks far more extensive than anyone suspected for this time period. The settlement's canal system showed another interesting feature. At certain points, the canals widened into basins. These basins had stone-lined bottoms, carefully placed to prevent erosion. The function became clear when excavators found the remains of wooden lock gates. These were primitive locks used to control water levels in different sections of the canal system. During high Nile floods, the gates could be closed to prevent the settlement from being inundated. During low water, they could be opened to allow boats to pass through. This is hydraulic engineering, understanding water flow, controlling it, using it to serve human purposes. The lock system wouldn't look out of place in much later periods. In fact, similar systems were used in medieval Europe. Yet here it was, functioning in the Delta in 5800 BCE. The settlement was occupied for approximately 400 years, from roughly 5800 to 5400 BCE. Then, rather suddenly, it was abandoned. The buildings were left standing, tools were left behind. Storage jars still contained grain. What happened? Geological analysis of the sediments provides an answer. Around 5400 BCE, a major flood event occurred. The Nile rose higher than usual, overwhelming the canal system's defenses. The settlement was buried under several meters of silt in a matter of days or weeks. The inhabitants would have had some warning. Floods don't happen instantaneously. They would have seen the water rising and would have evacuated, but they couldn't save their city. The flood that destroyed this settlement buried it so completely that it remained hidden for more than 7,000 years. And this raises a troubling question. How many other settlements remain buried? The delta has been continuously inhabited for thousands of years. Silt accumulates constantly. What we can see on the surface is only the most recent layer. Beneath it lie earlier periods, and beneath those, earlier still. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted since 2015 have identified at least 30 other subsurface anomalies in the delta that show the same characteristics as Kafr Hassan Dawood. Rectangular structures, grid layouts, canal systems. Most haven't been excavated. There's no funding, no time, and in many cases, modern towns sit directly on top of them, making excavation impossible without relocating living communities. But the implications are clear. The delta was home to sophisticated urban centers thousands of years before we thought such things existed in Egypt. These centers had advanced architecture, engineering, trade networks, and specialized production. They represent a civilization that flourished in the marshlands, while the desert peoples were watching stars, and the mountain people were carving platforms. A civilization adapted to water, to boats, to trade. When the climate changed and forced migrations began, the Delta people had knowledge to contribute. They knew canals, they knew locks, they knew how to move heavy stones by water, they knew trade and measurement systems. All of this knowledge would later prove crucial for building the pyramids. The massive stones of Giza didn't walk to the plateau. They came by water, floated on barges down canals, lifted and moved using techniques developed by people who had spent thousands of years mastering water transport. The buried cities of the Delta are still mostly hidden, but what we've found so far reveals a crucial piece of the puzzle. The sophistication of pharaonic Egypt didn't appear suddenly. It was built on foundations laid thousands of years earlier by people whose cities now lie beneath the fields and towns of the modern Delta. People who solved problems, created systems, and passed their knowledge forward to a future they couldn't imagine. By 4500 BCE, the different threads began to weave together. The desert peoples, driven east by climate change, bring their astronomical knowledge, their understanding of stellar movements, their traditions of marking time with aligned stones. The Red Sea mountain craftsmen bring metalworking expertise and stone carving techniques. Their knowledge of abrasives, of precision cutting, of training apprentices in specialized skills. The Delta people bring hydraulic engineering, canal building, water transport, trade networks, measurement systems. The Fayum communities bring grain storage technology, organized agriculture, and experience with large-scale building projects. All of these groups converge on the Nile Valley. They don't arrive as conquerors or invaders. They come as refugees from a changing climate, seeking permanent water. They settle among the agricultural communities already there. Ideas mix, techniques combine, innovation accelerates. In the archaeological record, we can see this convergence happening. Around 4500 BCE, Nile Valley sites suddenly show influence from multiple directions. Pottery styles from the Western Desert appear alongside delta forms. Stone tools show techniques from the Red Sea mountains. Astronomical alignments appear in building layouts. The The cubit, that standardized unit of measurement, becomes universal. At Hierakonpolis in Upper Egypt, excavations have revealed a temple complex dating to 3800 BCE. The temple shows all the threads woven together. The foundation is laid on a platform of carefully cut stone blocks. Red Sea Mountain technique. The temple itself is aligned to the summer solstice sunrise with precision. Napta knowledge. A canal connects the temple to the Nile, allowing boat access. Delta engineering. Storage facilities around the temple can hold surplus grain for years. Fayum organizational skill. And in the temple's inner chamber, archaeologists found something remarkable. A stone altar carved with astronomical symbols that show the position of Orion's belt as it appeared in 4000 BCE. All the knowledge streams had fed into this one structure. It represents synthesis, the coming together of different traditions into something new, something recognizably Egyptian. Over the next 1,000 years, this synthesis would deepen, the techniques would be refined, the scale would increase, and eventually, around 2700 BCE, someone would propose building a structure unlike anything the world had seen. A mountain made by human hands. A structure so precisely aligned to the cardinal directions that it would demonstrate complete mastery of astronomy. Built from stones so massive that moving them would require sophisticated understanding of leverage, friction, and water transport. The pyramids. But they didn't appear from nowhere. Every technique used in their construction had been developed over thousands of years by cultures that modern history barely acknowledges. The precise stone cutting came from the Red Sea workshops, where master craftsmen had been training apprentices since 7000 BCE. The astronomical alignments came from the desert peoples who had watched stars from Nabta and the western stone circles since 6000 BCE. The water transport came from Delta engineers who had been building canals and lock systems since 5800 BCE. The organizational capability came from Fayum communities who had been managing surplus grain storage and large-scale projects since 5400 BCE. The mathematical knowledge came from groups who had been using standardized measurements and recording calculations in stone since 6200 BCE. Every piece was already there. The pyramid builders assembled these pieces into something magnificent, but they didn't invent them. They inherited them. This changes how we should think about the pyramids. They're not anomalies, not sudden bursts of genius appearing without precedent. They're the culmination of a story thousands of years in the making. A story of people adapting to a changing climate, of groups migrating and meeting, of knowledge being shared, combined, and refined across generations. The civilization that built the pyramids was built on the knowledge of people who came before. People who left no names, no royal inscriptions, no grand monuments proclaiming their achievements, but who left something more enduring, the knowledge itself. In stone platforms carved into desert mountains, in astronomical alignments marked by circles in the sand, in canal systems buried beneath delta silt, in foundation blocks carved with mathematical notations, in stone vessels so precisely made that we still marvel at them. The true builders of Giza were not the workers of the 4th dynasty alone. They were all the people across all the millennia who contributed pieces of knowledge to the tradition. The star watchers, the stone carvers, the canal builders, the metal workers, the mathematicians, the engineers. Their names are lost. Their faces are unknown. Their individual stories are forgotten, but their legacy stands in the desert, aligned to the stars they watched, built with the techniques they developed, encoded with the knowledge they preserved. The pyramids are theirs as much as they belong to Khufu or Khafre, perhaps more so. The desert wind blows across Giza tonight, as it has for thousands of years. The same wind that blew when the pyramids were new. The same wind that blew when Nabta's stones were raised. The same wind that dried the Sahara and drove its people east to the Nile. The stones remember everything, not in words, but in their placement, in their alignments, in the techniques used to shape them, in the knowledge encoded in every precisely cut surface. We're only beginning to read what they have to tell us. Each new discovery pushes the timeline back further. Each excavation reveals more sophistication, more knowledge, existing earlier than we thought possible. The story of Egypt doesn't begin with the pharaohs. It begins thousands of years earlier, in places most people have never heard of, with people whose names we'll never know, but whose knowledge built one of humanity's greatest achievements. As you drift towards sleep tonight, let this knowledge settle gently in your mind. The pyramids are not mysteries, they're messages, not from gods or lost civilizations from other worlds, from humans like us, who watched the same stars, who solved problems with patience and ingenuity, who built on the knowledge of those who came before them. They left us clues, written in stone, waiting across millennia to be read. Rest well, knowing that every great achievement has roots deeper than we imagine, that knowledge builds across generations, that the foundations of our world were laid by countless hands, most of them forgotten. The stars wheel overhead, as they did when people first learned to track them. The Nile flows north, as it did when the first canal builders learned to shape its waters. And the stones of Giza stand silent, holding secrets we're only now learning to hear. Until next time, sleep well, and remember, history is deeper than we know.